The execution of Jesus of Nazareth, it's one of the most famous stories in human history. But what happens if we look at it like a cold case? I mean, let's just set aside theology for a second and put on our investigator hats. What were the raw political forces that put a spiritual teacher on a Roman cross? That's what we're going to dig into. The politics, the social clashes, and the specific actions that made his death, well, a necessity for the powers that be.
This sentence right here, this is our single most important clue. It's the Titulus, the official charge that was literally nailed to the cross. And you got to notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say blasphemer. It doesn't say heretic. It says King of the Jews. That is a political charge, plain and simple. For the Roman Empire, this wasn't about religion at all. This was sedition. It was a claim to an authority that belonged to Caesar and Caesar alone.
So that's the central mystery, isn't it? How does a guy whose whole ministry is about a spiritual kingdom of God end up with a state execution for political rebellion? The answer, well, it's not simple. It's actually a story about a collision course with pretty much every single power player in first-century Judea.
And that collision course really kicks into high gear with one single dramatic event. The one thing that, overnight, made Jesus an absolutely intolerable threat to the Jerusalem elite. We're talking about the incident at the temple.
Now, this is a really crucial reframing. We usually picture this as, a righteous outburst against a few crooked money changers. But the historical reality was so much more explosive. This was a prophetic attack on the entire temple system. The temple was the economic engine for the ruling class, and it was a key part of their cozy relationship with Rome.
Just think about what that means. By disrupting the temple's finances, Jesus wasn't just causing a little scene. He was basically taking a sledgehammer to the very foundation of the high priest's power. So in their eyes, he instantly became a profound security threat. From that moment on, his execution wasn't just a possibility. For them, it was a political and economic necessity.
But, the temple incident didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was really the explosive finale of a ministry that was already challenging the entire social order. And to really get this, we've got to talk about the politics of purity and inclusion in his world.
So at the heart of this whole social structure, you had groups like the Pharisees. And it's fascinating. Their very name in Hebrew, Perushim, it literally means the separated ones. Their whole identity was built on creating and maintaining boundaries through these really strict purity laws. These rules decided who was in and who was out, who was clean and who was unclean. It was the absolute bedrock of the social hierarchy.
And Jesus' program? It was the polar opposite. He practiced this radical form of inclusion. He deliberately ate with and hung out with the very people the system labeled unclean. We're talking tax collectors, sinners, all the outcasts. He wasn't just being nice. He was actively demolishing the very boundaries the entire religious system was built on.
So what did this social revolution actually look like? Well, by declaring the marginalized clean, he offered them unconditional acceptance. And by doing that, he completely nullified the moral authority of the ruling elite, who saw themselves as the gatekeepers of all this. His goal was to create a radically egalitarian community, a place where those social lines, they just didn't exist anymore. This was way more than just a spiritual idea. It was a societal upheaval in the making.
So what was the source code, the operating system for this whole revolutionary program? Well, it came straight from his core teachings, which basically reinterpreted the very foundations of Jewish law and tradition for a totally new kind of kingdom.
He would take these established laws, things everyone knew, like you shall not murder, and then he'd radically deepen them. He turned it into an internal demand, don't even be angry. All of a sudden, the focus wasn't just on external actions that the authorities could police, but on an internal, heart-level ethic. I mean, this was an incredibly bold move. He was essentially claiming the authority to reinterpret the Torah itself.
And his teachings had this razor-sharp economic edge, too. Take the famous prayer, "Forgive us our debts." Now, to our modern ears, that sounds like a metaphor for sin, right? But in Roman Judea, a place with crushing taxation and runaway debt, that word debts was literal, and it was political dynamite.
What he was doing was tapping into the powerful Jubilee tradition, this ancient mandate for a radical economic reset, a giant do-over. When he called for the forgiveness of debts, he was calling to tear down the unjust economic order that was making the powerful rich and crushing the poor. This was a direct assault on the financial structure of the entire province.
Okay, so when you put it all together, a social program, a religious program, and an economic program that threatens every single level of the power structure, you start to see how this spiritual mission was inevitably going to be seen as an act of political rebellion.
And here's the brilliant, if cynical, political move. The local Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, they might have seen his crime as blasphemy, but they knew that charge meant absolutely nothing to the Roman governor. So they translated it. The religious claim of being the Son of God got turned into the political charge of claiming to be the King of the Jews, a direct act of sedition against Caesar that Rome had to punish.
And that act of political translation set off a rapid-fire chain of events. The provocation at the temple led straight to his arrest by the temple authorities. They, in turn, handed him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, on the charge of insurrection. And the final verdict from Rome was swift: crucifixion, the standard punishment for exactly that crime.
And honestly, the method of execution tells us everything we need to know about how Rome saw this. Crucifixion wasn't just a way to kill somebody. It was a form of political theater. It was a brutal public statement, a punishment reserved for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. The punishment itself confirms that in the eyes of Rome, Jesus' crime was one thing and one thing only: insurrection.
Look, for a guy like Pontius Pilate, this was a day at the office, not some deep theological debate. His one and only job was to keep the peace in a notoriously difficult province. So from his perspective, executing Jesus was just a pragmatic political calculation. It solved a bunch of problems at once. It appeased the powerful local leaders he needed to work with. It got rid of a guy attracting huge, unpredictable crowds. And it sent a terrifying message to anyone else who might get any messianic ideas.
Which leaves us with this final question to chew on. Was this all just a fatal misunderstanding of a peaceful spiritual message? Or, given the truly radical nature of his program, a program that took direct aim at the heart of social, economic, and political power, was a violent collusion with the Roman state and its local partners simply inevitable? That's the historical puzzle.